Jake Matthews adjusted his backpack straps, feeling the comfortable weight of his camping gear against his shoulders. Around him, 11 other Boy Scouts from Troop 242 chatted excitedly about their weekend adventure in the Cascade Mountains. Their scoutmaster, Mr. Henderson, led the group with practiced ease, occasionally pointing out interesting flora or animal tracks along the path. "Hey, check this out." Tommy Rodriguez called from the back of the group, his voice carrying a note of curiosity. "I think I saw something move in those bushes." The troop paused, turning their attention to where Tommy pointed. The undergrowth rustled again, and Jake instinctively took a step closer, his heart racing with anticipation. Mr. Henderson raised his hand, signaling the boys to stay quiet. From behind a thick patch of ferns emerged a dog, tired, dirty, and moving with careful steps. Its coat, which might have once been a rich golden color, was matted with mud and bits of forest debris. Despite its disheveled appearance, there was something dignified about the way it held itself, like a warrior who had seen too many battles but refused to surrender. Chris Weber, Jake's best friend since third grade, whispered, "It looks like it's been out here for ages." The dog's ears perked up at the sound of Chris's voice, and it turned its head toward the group. Jake noticed its eyes, warm brown and incredibly intelligent, but carrying a sadness that seemed almost human. The animal took a tentative step forward, its tail giving the slightest wag. "Easy there, buddy," Jake said softly, crouching down to make himself less intimidating. He reached into his pack side pocket, where he kept emergency trail mix. The dog's nose twitched at the sound of the package crinkling. Mr. Henderson moved closer, his experienced eyes scanning the animal for any signs of aggression or illness. "He's wearing a collar," he observed. "Definitely someone's pet, but he's been out here for a while by the look of him." Jake slowly extended his hand, letting the dog catch his scent. After a moment's hesitation, the dog moved forward, pressing its nose against Jake's palm. The connection was immediate and profound. Jake felt as if he was touching a piece of living history, a creature that carried countless untold stories in its heart. "What's on his collar?" Michael Chong asked, edging closer but maintaining a respectful distance. Jake carefully reached for the worn leather collar, noting how the dog remained perfectly still, as if understanding the importance of this inspection. The metal tag was weathered, its engravings barely legible. He could make out what looked like initials, TR, and traces of what might have been a phone number, now too eroded to read. "We can't just leave him out here," Jake declared, looking up at Mr. Henderson. The scoutmaster's face showed the careful consideration of a man weighing multiple responsibilities: the safety of his troop, the schedule they needed to maintain, and the moral obligation to help an animal in need. After a moment, Mr. Henderson nodded. "We're only about a mile from our planned campsite. He can come with us while we figure out what to do next." The decision sparked immediate excitement among the scouts. Tommy offered his water bottle, pouring some into his cupped hand for the dog to drink. Michael pulled out a protein bar, carefully breaking off pieces to share. The dog accepted their offerings with gentle gratitude, its tail wagging with increasing confidence. "We should give him a name," Chris suggested, "at least while he's with us." "Buddy," Jake said without hesitation. The name had come to him naturally, feeling right for this four-legged stranger who had wandered into their lives. The dog's ears perked up, and several of the scouts laughed in delight. "Looks like he approves," Mr. Henderson said with a smile. As they resumed their hike, Buddy fell in a step beside Jake, moving with a peculiar mix of weariness and determination. The other scouts took turns walking nearby, each feeling drawn to the mysterious visitor. Jake couldn't shake the feeling that finding Buddy was more than just chance. It felt like the beginning of something important. The remainder of the afternoon's hike took on a different character with Buddy's presence. The scouts' usual trail games and conversations gave way to speculation about their new companion's story. Where had he come from? How long had he been in these woods? Who was TR? And what had happened to separate them from their loyal friend? When they reached their campsite, a clearing nestled between tall pines with a small stream nearby, the troop fell into their usual routines of setting up tents and gathering firewood, but with a new energy. Buddy watched their activities with interest, occasionally following different scouts as they went about their tasks, as if he was both supervising and learning. Jake and Chris were assigned to collect water from the stream, and Buddy accompanied them without hesitation. As they filled their containers, Jake noticed how Buddy seemed to scan the opposite bank, his posture alert but not tense. "He acts like he knows these woods," Chris observed, securing the cap on his water bottle. "Like he's looking for something? Or someone?" Jake nodded, watching as Buddy's gaze tracked something unseen in the distance. "Maybe he is. Dogs are supposed to be really loyal, right? What if he's been out here all this time, searching?" The thoughts settled over them like an evening mist, both beautiful and slightly chilling. The idea that this dog might have spent months, maybe years, faithful to a lost companion sparked something in Jake's chest, a mixture of admiration and sadness that made him want to help even more. As darkness began to fall, Mr. Henderson got a fire going, and the scouts gathered around its warmth. Buddy found a spot between Jake and Chris, accepting the portions of hot dogs and beans the boys shared with him. The flames cast dancing shadows across his fur, now slightly cleaner thanks to a brief wade in the stream. "Tomorrow," Mr. Henderson announced, "we'll split into groups and see if we can find any information about Buddy's owner. The ranger station isn't too far, and there are usually some hikers at the main trailhead who might know something." The scouts nodded in agreement, but Jake's attention was on Buddy, who had lifted his head at the word owner, his ears forward and alert. There was something in the dog's eyes that spoke of longing and memory, a depth of feeling that Jake had never associated with animals before. As the fire died down and the scouts retreated to their tents, Buddy remained by Jake's side. Mr. Henderson had agreed to let the dog sleep in Jake and Chris's tent, recognizing both the bond that had formed and the practicality of keeping their guests close. Inside the tent, as Chris's breathing evolved into soft snores, Jake lay awake, one hand resting on Buddy's fur. The dog's presence was comforting, yet Jake couldn't shake the feeling that they had stumbled onto something much bigger than a simple lost pet story. Through the tent's mesh window, Jake could see stars peeking through gaps in the forest canopy. He wondered if Buddy had spent many nights looking at these same stars, waiting and searching for whatever, or whoever, he had lost. The mystery of it all swirled in Jake's mind as he finally drifted off to sleep, his dreams filled with wandering paths and loyal hearts that refused to give up. In the deep of night, Jake briefly awoke to find Buddy sitting up, his silhouette outlined by moonlight filtering through the tent fabric. The dog's head was turned toward the forest, as if listening to distant echoes of the past. In that moment, Jake made a silent promise. They would help Buddy find his way back home, no matter what it took. The sound of gentle rain on the tent fly eventually lulled Jake back to sleep, but not before he noticed Buddy settling back down, pressing closer to his side. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and, hopefully, answers. For now, though, the simple comfort of companionship was enough. A boy and a dog, each finding something they didn't know they needed in the other's presence. The next morning dawned with a crisp clarity that only mountain air can bring. As Jake emerged from his tent, Buddy at his heels, he found Mr. Henderson already up, tending to a small breakfast fire. The scoutmaster's face carried the thoughtful expression of a man who had been pondering a complex problem. "Good morning, Jake," Mr. Henderson said, stirring a pot of oatmeal. "I've been thinking about how best to approach our search. We'll need to be systematic about this." Other scouts began emerging from their tents, drawn by the smell of breakfast and the excitement of the day ahead. Tommy Rodriguez pulled out a small notebook from his backpack, his journalist aspirations showing through. "We should document everything we learn," he suggested, already jotting down notes about their encounter with Buddy the previous day. As the troop gathered around the fire, spooning hot oatmeal into their bowls and sharing their morning observations, Mr. Henderson outlined his plan. "We'll divide into 4 groups of 3. Each team will take a different direction and talk to anyone they can find. Hikers, rangers, anyone who might have seen Buddy before." Chris raised his hand, still chewing a mouthful of breakfast. "What about the initials on his collar? TR, could that help us?" "Good thinking," Mr. Henderson nodded. "We'll definitely mention those to the rangers. They keep records of regular hikers and any incidents in the area." Jake watched as Buddy moved among the scouts, accepting gentle pats and shared bites of breakfast. In the morning light, the dog's coat showed hints of its original golden color beneath the dirt and tangles. There was something regal about him, Jake thought, like a displaced king who had never forgotten his true nature. The teams were quickly organized. Jake, Chris, and Michael would head toward the ranger station to the east. Tommy's group would explore the main hiking trails to the north. The other teams would cover the south and west, where several popular camping areas were located. Before they separated, Mr. Henderson gathered them for a final briefing. Remember your training, boys. Stay together. Keep your compasses handy, and use your whistles if you run into any trouble. We'll meet back here at 2 o'clock, no matter what we find. Jake's team set out with Buddy naturally falling into step beside them. The path to the ranger station was well-maintained but steep in places, winding through dense forest before opening into occasional clearings. As they walked, Michael kept track of their route on a topographical map, while Chris looked for signs that might indicate Buddy's previous presence in the area. About halfway to their destination, they encountered an elderly hiker resting on a fallen log. His weathered face broke into a smile at the sight of Buddy. "Well now," he said, adjusting his wire-rimmed glasses. "There's a familiar face." Jake's heart leaped. "You've seen him before?" The old man nodded slowly, reaching into his pack for a water bottle. "A few days ago, further up the mountain, he was moving with purpose, like he was following something only he could sense. Wouldn't come when I called, just gave me a look and kept going." He took a long drink before continuing. "Funny thing is, he reminded me of another dog I used to see up here years ago. Same proud way of carrying himself." The three scouts exchanged glances. Chris pulled out Tommy's notebook, which they'd borrowed for their search. "Could you tell us more about that other dog?" he asked. The hiker's eyes grew distant, as if looking into the past. "That would have been, must be 5 years ago now. There was this fellow, regular hiker, had a golden retriever, just like your friend here. They were fixtures on these trails, those two. Man's name was Tom, if I remember right. Tom Rivers." Jake felt Buddy stir beside him, the dog's ears perking up at the name. It could have been coincidence, but something in Buddy's reaction made Jake's spine tingle. "What happened to them?" Michael asked, voicing the question they were all thinking. The old hiker shook his head. "That's the strange part. One day they just stopped coming. Heard some rumors about Tom going missing, but I was away that season, never got the full story." He looked at Buddy with renewed interest. "You don't suppose?" Jake knelt beside Buddy, running a hand through his fur. "TR," he said quietly. "Tom Rivers?" Buddy's tail wagged once, slowly, and he pressed his nose against Jake's hand. The boys thanked the hiker and continued toward the ranger station with new urgency in their steps. The possibility that Buddy might be connected to an old missing person case added layers of complexity to their mission, but it also made their purpose feel even more important. The ranger station was a solid log building with a green metal roof and a wide porch wrapped around 3 sides. As they approached, a female ranger emerged, clipboard in hand. Her nameplate read Ranger Sarah Martinez. "Well, hello there," she greeted them, her experienced eyes taking in their Boy Scout uniforms and then fixing on Buddy. "What brings you boys up here today?" Jake explained their situation, including their morning encounter with the elderly hiker and the possible connection to Tom Rivers. As he spoke, he noticed how Ranger Martinez's expression shifted from professional interest to deep concern. "Come inside," she said after a moment. "There's something you should see." The interior of the station was cool and smelled of pine cleaner and coffee. Ranger Martinez led them to a bulletin board where, among various notices and wildlife warnings, hung a faded missing person poster. The photograph showed a man in his early 40s with kind eyes and a warm smile, standing on a mountain trail. Beside him sat a younger, cleaner version of the dog now standing in their midst. "Tom Rivers disappeared 5 years ago this coming August," Ranger Martinez explained, pulling out a thick file from a nearby cabinet. "He was an experienced hiker, knew these mountains better than most. His dog, Scout, was his name. What missing with him?" "Scout," Jake whispered, looking down at Buddy. "No, Scout." The dog's tail wagged at his old name, and his eyes seemed to hold years of unspoken stories. Ranger Martinez continued, flipping through the file. We conducted extensive searches for weeks. Found his backpack eventually about 6 miles from here, but no other signs. His dog was never found either. Most assumed he'd gotten lost with Tom, or she didn't finish the sentence, but they all understood the implications. Yet here was Scout, very much alive, still roaming the mountains where he'd last seen his master. The thing is, Ranger Martinez added, her voice softening, there were reports over the years. Hikers saying they'd seen a dog matching Scout's description, always in different parts of the mountain. Most of us thought they were just stories, people seeing what they wanted to see. But now, Chris had been quiet for a while, but now he spoke up. He's been searching. All this time, he's been looking for Tom. The realization settled over them like a heavy blanket. 5 years of loyalty, 5 years of refusing to give up hope. Jake felt tears pricking at his eyes and didn't try to hide them. Ranger Martinez made some calls while the boys sat with Scout on the station's porch. Within an hour, they learned that Tom Rivers' sister still lived in the nearby town of Millbrook. The ranger offered to contact her, but Jake asked if they could be the ones to bring Scout home. I think he needs to complete this journey with friends, he explained, surprising himself with the wisdom in his words. As they headed back to their campsite to meet the other groups, Jake noticed a difference in Scout's behavior. The dog walked with new energy, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. Perhaps knowing that they understood his mission, that they were helping him find his way back to what remained of his family, had given him renewed purpose. The other search teams had their own stories to share when they regrouped. Tommy's group had met a rock climber who remembered seeing Scout near the old fire tower 2 days ago. Another team had found what might have been old paw prints near a stream crossing. Each piece of information helped paint a picture of Scout's solitary vigil over the years. Mr. Henderson listened to their discoveries with growing amazement. When they finished, he made a decision that changed their weekend plans entirely. Tomorrow, he announced, we're going to help Scout find his way home. That night, around the campfire, the troop was quieter than usual, each boy lost in thoughts about loyalty, love, and the incredible dog in their midst. Scout moved from scout to scout, accepting their gentle touches and sharing their warmth, as if thanking them for helping him carry his long burden. Jake lay awake again that night, listening to Scout's steady breathing. He thought about Tom Rivers, about the bond between a man and his dog that was strong enough to sustain a 5-year search through these vast mountains. In the darkness of the tent, Jake wondered if Scout had somehow known all along that this moment would come, that eventually someone would understand his story and help him complete his journey. As dawn approached, bringing with it the promise of their final mission, Jake felt Scout stir beside him. The dog's eyes caught the first gray light of morning, reflecting a wisdom that seemed ancient and profound. Together, they stepped out into the cool mountain air, ready to face whatever the day might bring. The troop broke camp with practiced efficiency, each scout moving with purpose, understanding the importance of the task ahead. Mr. Henderson had already radioed ahead to coordinate their arrival in Millbrook, and Tom Rivers' sister, Sarah, was expecting them by early afternoon. Their hike down the mountain took on an almost ceremonial quality. Scout led the way with confident steps, as if he was finally ready to leave his long vigil behind. The other scouts followed in respectful silence, broken only by the occasional crunch of boots on gravel and the whisper of wind through the pines. At one point, Scout paused at a fork in the trail, his head turning toward a steep path that disappeared into thick undergrowth. Jake knew, somehow, that this was where Tom had last been seen, where Scout's lonely quest had begun. The dog stood still for a long moment, as if saying goodbye to a memory, before deliberately choosing the path that led down to the valley. As they descended, the forest gradually gave way to meadows, and finally to the outskirts of Millbrook. The small town sprawled beneath them, its streets lined with maple trees just beginning to show hints of autumn color. Sarah Rivers' house was a modest blue cottage on the edge of town with a well-tended garden and a white picket fence that had seen better days. When they reached the front gate, Scout's composure finally broke. His tail began to wag with increasing urgency, and a small whine escaped his throat. The screen door opened, and Sarah Rivers stepped onto the porch. She was a tall woman with graying hair and her brother's kind eyes, and at the sight of Scout, her hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered, tears already streaming down her face. "Scout!" The dog bounded forward with an energy that belied his years, meeting Sarah at the bottom of the porch steps. She fell to her knees, wrapping her arms around his neck as Scout whined and pressed against her, his entire body trembling with emotion. The Scouts stood in respectful silence, many wiping tears from their own eyes as they witnessed the reunion. Jake felt Chris's hand on his shoulder, offering silent support as they watched Scout finally complete his journey home. Later, as they sat in Sarah's living room, she shared stories about Tom and Scout's adventures in the mountains. She showed them photographs of happier days, Tom and Scout by mountain lakes on sunny peaks and snowy valleys. In each image, the bond between man and dog was palpable, a connection that had proven stronger than time itself. Tom always said Scout was one in a million, Sarah told them, her voice thick with emotion. He used to joke that if anything ever happened to him, Scout would never stop looking. She paused, running her hand over Scout's head where it rested in her lap. He was right. As the afternoon light began to fade, Mr. Henderson gathered the troop to leave. Each Scout took a moment to say goodbye to Scout, who accepted their farewells with dignified grace. When it was Jake's turn, he knelt before the dog who had taught him so much about loyalty and love. "Goodbye, Scout," he whispered, pressing his forehead briefly against the dog's. "Thank you for letting us be part of your story." Scout's tail wagged once, and he licked Jake's cheek, a gesture that felt like both a thank you and a blessing. As they walked away from the blue cottage, Jake looked back one last time. Scout sat proudly on the porch beside Sarah, no longer the lost wanderer they'd found in the woods, but a guardian returned to his post. The setting sun caught his fur, and for a moment he seemed to glow with an inner light, as if Tom's love had been made visible in the golden evening air. Years later, Jake would often think back to that weekend in the mountains, to the dog who had never given up, and to the powerful lesson he had learned about the endurance of love and loyalty. Scout's story became a legend in Troop 242, passed down to new Scouts around countless campfires, a reminder that some bonds transcend time and distance, and that faith, in its purest form, can light the way home through the darkest of forests. And sometimes, on crisp autumn evenings when the wind whispered through the pines, Jake would look up at the mountains and smile, knowing that somewhere up there, Scout's unwavering devotion had carved invisible trails of love across the wilderness, mapping the geography of a heart that had finally found its way home. The autumn wind carried hints of approaching winter as Jake stared at the yellowed newspaper clipping in his hands. 2 weeks had passed since they'd reunited Scout with Sarah Rivers, but the mystery of Tom's disappearance continued to haunt him. The article, dated 5 years ago, detailed the extensive search efforts in the mountains, including interviews with other hikers who had seen Tom and Scout on that fateful day. "I've been doing some research," Chris said, spreading more papers across Jake's bedroom desk. After their return from the mountains, the two boys had thrown themselves into investigating Tom's disappearance, spending hours at the local library's archives and interviewing longtime residents of Millbrook. The more they uncovered, the more complex the story became. Tom Rivers hadn't been just another hiker. He'd been an experienced mountaineer who knew the terrain intimately. According to old trail registers and ranger reports, he and Scout had logged thousands of miles across the Cascades, often helping lost hikers find their way back to safety. Jake's finger traced the grainy photograph accompanying the article. "Look at this," he said, pointing to a detail in the background of Tom's last known photo. Behind him and Scout stood an old fire tower, its weather-beaten frame stark against the clouded sky. Chris leaned in closer. "That's near where Tommy's group saw Scout 2 days before we found him," he realized, excitement creeping into his voice. "What if he keeps going back there?" The idea took root immediately. Jake reached for his phone, scrolling through his contacts until he found Sarah Rivers' number. She answered on the second ring, her voice warm but carrying an undercurrent of perpetual sadness that Jake had come to recognize. "Mrs. Rivers," Jake began, "we found something in an old newspaper. The fire tower." Was it special to Tom? There was a long pause on the other line, filled only with the sound of Sarah's breathing. When she spoke again, her voice trembled slightly. He proposed to Ginny there, she said finally. His fiancée. They were supposed to get married that December. Jake and Chris exchanged glances. This was new information. None of the newspaper articles had mentioned a fiancé. What happened to her? Jake asked softly. She moved away after. Sarah's voice trailed off. It was too painful for her to stay. The mountains held too many memories. Another pause. But she sent me a letter last month. She's coming back to Millbrook. Said she needs closure. The pieces began falling into place in Jake's mind. Scout's regular returns to the fire tower, his unwavering search patterns. He hadn't just been looking for Tom. He'd been guarding the place where his master had been happiest. Over the next few days, Jake and Chris compiled their findings, creating a detailed timeline of Tom's last known movements. They marked maps with Scout's reported sightings over the years, forming a pattern that centered around the fire tower and the surrounding valleys. Mr. Henderson, impressed by their dedication, helped them present their research to Ranger Martinez. "This is remarkable work, boys," she said, studying their maps. The ranger station's office was warmer now that winter approached, and a cup of steaming coffee sat untouched on her desk. "We never made these connections during the original search. We think Scout was trying to tell us something all along," Jake explained. He kept returning to these specific areas. What if he was marking the trail that he and Tom took that day? Ranger Martinez nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. The original search focused on the main trails, assuming Tom would have stuck to familiar routes. But if he went off trail, he might have found something, Chris finished. Something important enough to make him change his plans. The ranger pulled out her own maps, comparing them with the boys' research. "There's an old mining survey site near the fire tower," she said, pointing to a barely visible marking. "It was abandoned decades ago, but some of the shaft entrances were never properly sealed." Jake felt a chill run down his spine that had nothing to do with the weather. Could Tom have found one of them? "It's possible," Ranger Martinez admitted. "We'll need to organize a proper search team to investigate safely. These old mines can be extremely dangerous." Word spread quickly through Millbrook about the boys' discovery. Sarah Rivers arrived at the ranger station the next morning, Scout by her side. The dog's demeanor had changed since coming home. He seemed more focused, more determined, as if he knew they were finally understanding his message. Jenny Miller, Tom's former fiancée, arrived 3 days later. She was a tall woman with auburn hair streaked with gray, her face bearing the kind of beauty that grief couldn't erase. When she saw Scout, she dropped to her knees, and the dog rushed to her, whining softly as he pressed his head against her shoulder. "You never gave up," she whispered into his fur. "You wonderful, faithful boy." The search team assembled on a clear, cold morning in late October. Professional cavers joined forest rangers and local search and rescue volunteers. Jake and Chris, along with Mr. Henderson and several other scouts from Troop 242, were allowed to join as support team members, helping to establish base camp near the fire tower. Scout led them up the mountain with surprising energy, stopping occasionally to ensure the group kept up. The old fire tower came into view around mid-morning, its skeletal frame reaching toward a pale blue sky. Jenny stood for a long moment at its base, her hand resting on the weathered wood, before Scout's urgent barking drew everyone's attention. The dog had found something, a narrow trail leading away from the tower, almost invisible beneath 5 years of accumulated debris. The search team followed cautiously, their equipment clanking softly as they descended into a steep valley Jake and Chris hadn't marked on their maps. The mine entrance was half hidden behind a curtain of vines and roots, its timbers rotted but still partially intact. Scout paced before it, whining with an intensity that made Jake's heart race. The rescue team moved forward with their equipment, while the others were held back at a safe distance. Hours passed in tense waiting. Jake sat with Chris and Jenny, watching Scout's unwavering vigilance at the edge of the safety perimeter. Sarah paced nearby, her hands clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. The call came just as the sun began to set. "We found him," crackled the radio. "We found Tom Rivers." The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Emergency medical teams rushed forward as the rescue team emerged from the mine carrying a stretcher. Tom Rivers, against all odds and explanation, was alive. He had fallen through a rotted section of the mine's upper level, landing in a partially flooded chamber below. The space had enough air pockets to sustain him, and underground springs provided water, but he had been trapped, unable to climb out, surviving on cave organisms in the hope that someone would find him. "Scout," he whispered hoarsely when they brought him out, and the dog broke free from Sarah's grasp, rushing to his master's side. The medical team allowed a brief reunion. Scout gently licking Tom's face while the man wept openly, his tears cutting tracks through the cave dust that covered his skin. Jenny stood frozen, her hands pressed to her mouth, until Tom's eyes found her. "You came back," he managed to say before his strength gave out, and the medical team rushed him to the waiting helicopter. As the helicopter disappeared over the mountains, Jake felt Chris's hand on his shoulder. No words were needed. They both understood the magnitude of what they had witnessed. Scout sat between them, his tail wagging slowly, his mission finally, truly complete. The story spread far beyond Millbrook, making national headlines. Lost hiker found after 5 years, led rescuers to site. But for Jake, the real story wasn't about the rescue or even the miracle of Tom's survival. It was about Scout's unwavering faith, about a love so pure and deep that it had literally moved mountains. In the months that followed, Jake often visited Tom and Scout at Sarah's house, where Tom was recovering his strength. Jenny had moved back to Millbrook, and the light in Tom's eyes when she visited spoke of a love that, like Scout's devotion, had survived the darkest of separations. Scout, no longer needing to patrol the mountains, had settled into a peaceful retirement, though his proud bearing remained unchanged. He would sit on the porch, watching the mountains with contented eyes, occasionally turning to make sure his family, all of his family, was still there. One spring evening, as Jake sat on the porch steps beside Scout, Tom joined them, moving slowly but steadily with his recovering legs. "You know," Tom said, his voice stronger now, "when I was down there, I never lost hope. Somehow I knew Scout wouldn't give up. Love like that, it lights the way home." Jake nodded, understanding flowing between man and boy and dog as they watched the setting sun paint the mountains in shades of gold. Some stories, he realized, don't end with goodbye. They end with hello, with reunion, with love that burns bright enough to pierce the deepest darkness. And in Millbrook, when people speak of loyalty, they speak of a dog who spent 5 years searching the mountains, marking trails with paw prints of devotion, until finally, he brought his family back together.